Hi, Coach TJ.
What's going on?
So, we have a super exciting podcast today. We're going to start by talking about some of our favorite lessons that we've seen at the Olympics. Then we're going to dive into the most common questions that we get as coaches. And then we're going to unpack a study about the differences between elite and non-elite trail runners and what amateur athletes can learn from elite trail runners' approach and training.
Awesome. Excited for it.
Yeah. So have you been watching much of the Olympics?
I've been keeping up a little bit with the news, but I haven't watched much. I watched the Novak Djokovic gold medal tennis match. But I haven't really watched much of the track and field. Haven't much watched. I watched a little of the triathlon, but not much actually.
So
what about you?
I have really been into the gymnastics team, and I think that's because there are some really incredible athletes like Simone Biles and Suni Lee who are sort of like emblematic of some really amazing lessons in athletics. As many people remember, Simone Biles withdrew from several competitions in the last Olympics because she got the twisties, which is sort of like it's sort of like the yips, but in gymnastics, the consequences for not knowing where you are in space and not being able to execute on a flip, could be life-ending. You could sustain serious neck and back injury. So she pulled out of the Olympics 4 years ago, and there were a lot of armchair quarterbacks giving some pretty crappy advice about her not being mentally tough enough, which always prioritizing mental and physical health long-term is the goal. B, she did her approach to coming back was really, really amazing. After she withdrew from the Olympics, she wasn't done with gymnastics, even though she was actually getting to an age where many people retire. She continued to train really hard. She continued to address mental health concerns. She continued to hone her craft and now has come back to become the most decorated American gymnast of all time.
So cool. It was really cool reading some of the stories about her from the last week. I think it's just so interesting when people comment on mental toughness in athletes and they make judgments about how they approach, something like getting the yips or the twisties. I've never heard that term, the twisties. It's sounds
specific to gymnastics.
Scary.
Yeah.
Watching, reruns of her on, what do they call that? The beam?
The beam, yeah.
That's what they call it? The beam? Is it okay, it's
just a beam.
It's just the beam?
Yes.
Yeah, on the beam. And I mean, I just can't imagine doing what she does, let alone with, all of the nerves that all athletes have going into events, particularly, events with a lot of pressure like the Olympics. It's, to me, I think a sign of mental toughness is knowing when you need to step back and address certain issues. Working with a therapist or sports psychologist, whomever is on your team.
Building out that support team.
Yeah, I mean, that's mental toughness.
Yeah.
Trying to ignore it, trying to fight through it.
Or quitting and walking away.
Right, that's not mental toughness.
Something I always tell my athletes is that we're not defined by the challenges that we encounter. We're defined by how we respond to them. And I think Simone Biles is an incredible example of someone who faced adversity and then worked through it. And that is really, when we think about the legacy we want to leave as athletes, when I think about how I want to show up as an athlete, as much as it might be nice to wish that it's just smooth sailing all the time, that's not the reality. And because everyone has to overcome stuff, right? Every athlete we've ever worked with has worked through a lot of adversity, but the grittiest athletes and often the highest performing athletes, they're not the ones that never face challenges. They're the ones that are able to move through challenge. And I think that is a defining characteristic of a high performing athlete.
Absolutely. Well, if you want to get good at anything, you've got to be good at dealing with challenge.
Yeah. I think something that was really fun and amazing also about Simone Biles' performance is she said the morning before she won the gold medal at the U.S. Gymnastics, in the team competition, she had an hour-long therapy session. And I think that, again, really specifically addressing mental health and mental performance, we're increasingly see that that's a key component of elite and high-performing athlete success. And that these things things can exist in the context of taking care of mental health. Noah Lyles, who won the 100-meter dash, actually ended the U.S.'s longest gold medal drought in that distance. Is like right after he won, he tweeted, "I have ADD, I have anxiety, I have depression. I don't let these things define me. Don't let them define, like, you too can work through these things." And I think being able to acknowledge very real, like, mental health concerns that we have, and then not letting them define and limit you because you're addressing them, right? That doesn't mean we doesn't mean we ignore them, we just like white knuckle through, but we're really seeing high performers acknowledge these things and work very hard to address them, and that is what really makes them champions. So we love Simone Biles going to therapy the morning before her competition. We love Noah Lyles tweeting about working through mental health stuff to become a gold medalist.
I mean, that's the champion's mindset right there. You know, everybody, every single athlete, all the people that we look up to have things that can limit them, whether it's physiology, whether it's with the mental side, psychology, other stresses in life. You know, nobody goes through life unscathed or without inherent challenges and limitations. And, like, you know, the stories these athletes have created around these things have really helped to change their perspective and to, you know, to make them building blocks for them rather than limitations. And that's just so important to understand. And it's fundamental for athletes, like, at every level. You know, when we talk about elites versus, you know, amateurs and what they do later in this call, I mean, just think about that. Like, you can be an amateur and have the mindset of a champion. Yeah. And that matters a lot.
Exactly. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about Katie Ledecky and how she approaches excellence. And I think that, I mean, she's the most decorated American swimmer of all time, just an incredible athlete. And there was a really great piece in the New Yorker magazine that I would encourage everyone to look up and read, where it unpacks her mental approach. And I pulled this quote from it. "These days, her goals are more about improving in training than achieving particular results in any big meet. Lap after lap, she counts her strokes and takes pleasure in it." And I love that because she attributes her success to taking pleasure in the process of getting better and being completely process focused. This is very microcosm coded, so like immediately I gravitated towards this article, but it's so true that we see the people who end up, you know, really going for these huge goals. It's not because they're motivated by the goals. It's because they're motivated by the process. They're motivated by seeing how much better they can get in training. And I really love that.
The contrast here between the Nike ads
that
have been running is really interesting to me.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Nike ad?
I just think that it's really flawed. Like the way.
Well, can you tell people what it was?
Basically, Nike had an ad running that was talking about just like the inherent kind of like attitude of champions being like, you know, winning is the only objective, and, you know, it's winning. It was kind of a winning at all costs mentality. And, you know, we know that through research that kind of mentality leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, and it actually erodes the process. And so when you see champions who are embracing this other approach, which is really the predominant approach here, it's just not the approach that our culture for some reason loves to embrace fully in the media. But I think it's really important just to recognize, like, you know, these athletes are competing for outcomes, and they do have an outcome orientation. They're not thinking, you know, it's not just about the process, and having an outcome orientation is a very big motivator. But if that's the only thing, it makes it a lot harder to enjoy the process. I love, you know, that she's counting the strokes. I mean, it's so it puts you in the present moment and kind of removes the obstacle that is the outcome, where if you're fully focused on the outcome, you're not actually focused on what you're doing, which can erode the quality of that training session. So there's just a lot of good stuff here in this.
I feel like a major duality of like how this comes up in my coaching is oftentimes people reach out when they have a goal, right? And that's when they're like, oh, I need a coach because I'm training for a 100-miler, I'm training for a marathon, I'm training for a 10K, whatever it is. Most people come to us with a goal in mind, my goal is always to show up for people and to coach people in a way where the goal becomes secondary to the process. And that's, again, one of the reasons that we do expect like a pretty high level of commitment from our athletes, because just being goal driven and goal oriented isn't shown to be effective for performance and long-term benefits. And being able to be happy in the process and enjoy the process, A, that's just a much better place to live life from, and B, will result in better outcomes. So I always really try to work with my athletes, like even if they do have a goal that's really important to them, like an A race, how can we live life that's more about the journey than the finish line? Because the finish line is such a small portion of what training is, of what running is. So how do we delight in the journey?
And that's the misunderstood thing about the finish line. The finish line is what it is because of the work that you've put in to get there.
Yeah.
It's not just about that race.
Yeah.
It's not just about that event. And, you need to look and understand the bigger picture. So important to longevity. This is my wheelhouse. I'm just kind of like, oh, it's nice to hear athletes out there and articles. I didn't read this particular article, but now I'm really interested in checking it out.
I dropped it in the Microcosm Slack channel. So everyone should check that out. And if you're not a part of the Microcosm community, I'll just make a quick plug here. You can join our Foothills tier, which gives you access to coaches and access to our Slack community. So you can go to microcosmcoaching.com and join our Foothills tier today. You can use the discount code Foothills10 to only pay $10 a month.
Yeah.
And that's where we have a lot of these really awesome conversations. So definitely something to not miss out on. Next, I want to go to our running FAQ.
Should I stretch before running?
You're just going right into it.
I just love this question.
So this is sort of a combination of just like questions we've gotten over the years in our email, questions we get from athletes in their training logs, and like also in our DMs on Instagram. And one of the most common ones is, should I stretch before I run? What do you think, Coach TJ?
There's not really any research that demonstrates that this lowers the risk of injury or helps prime you for a better workout or a better run. So
yeah, there's actually some research that it diminishes muscle tension and can lead to sort of like dead legs and not as much pep in your step.
I think some dynamic warm-ups are great, like leg swings, maybe some calf raises, centric heel drops. Knee drivers, could do some like light banded work like monster walks, but I wouldn't do anything that taxes the legs, creates any soreness. Just something that primes the system.
Right. The goal with the warm up is to reinforce the neuromuscular patterns that we're going to see in running. So high knees, butt kicks, sort of like doing an exaggerated form of the movement that we're going to be deploying in running.
Muscle activation.
Muscle activation. Essentially getting your body and brain on the same page. And also when you warm up, like your joints release a little bit of like lubricant essentially. So getting that process going before we just immediately start hammering out miles.
How about how often should I run?
Man, I feel like the answer to like almost all of these questions, besides stretching, is it depends. And I think that, I know we say this all the time, but this is why it is so important to work with a coach who understands you, your goals, and your needs, is because anyone that gives you a broad prescription of like 4 days a week of running or like 35 miles a week, don't walk away from that person. But running frequency, or how often you run, is really one of the most fundamental variables in training. The other variables being intensity and duration. And generally speaking, research shows that people need to run at least a couple times a week to get any benefit, although most people don't need to rack up triple-digit mileage weeks that elite athletes do. So that's anywhere between 3 days being the bare minimum to provoke to not lose. Actually, it's not even like you will probably, a lot of folks will even lose fitness with that little frequency.
Depends on where
they
are.
But if you're only running twice a week, that's really sort of being in the territory of like, you're not going to be adapting at all. And each bout is sort of more than, it's not really going to render you any fitter, but it does increase your risk for injury. So that's one of the reasons we always stress consistency and frequency.
Minimum of 3 days a week is what
and that's
I like to see
for an off season or like a really limited athlete.
Yep.
So again, there's no right answer to this question. You'll need to take your goals, your life stress, and your athletic background into consideration when you're formulating a running plan. Most experts agree that beginner runners should aim to run 3 to 4 days a week with at least 1 day of complete rest and maybe some optional cross training.
Yeah. I really, and this is probably my coaching bias, but I find that when beginner runners can finally make that jump from 4 to 5 days a week, it makes a huge difference because that stress balance becomes so much more manageable. Every day is not too significant of a stress that we're now like risking injury, and we can then really easily increase volume week to week, which is where those benefits start to really happen.
Right.
So, if you're one of those runners who's kind of stuck running 2 to 3 days a week, think about how, over the course of a couple months, you could boost that up to 4 to 5 runs.
Right.
That could make a huge difference for you.
Totally. Like, let's say you were trying to run 25 miles a week. It would be better to do 5-mile runs than like 3 8.5-mile runs, because each bout is going to be like a higher dose of stress than is beneficial, and you're not going to be able to adapt. And so that's one of the reasons that we really see runners focusing on run frequency as opposed to hammering out super long runs less frequently. It's just better. It's better for how the body adapts to stress.
What running shoes are best for a runner, Zoe?
It depends.
The ones that work best for your feet?
Exactly. So often we get questions about what running shoes we like, and I'm often pretty reluctant to share anything because I don't want to sway athletes, because I'm pretty particular. We like different running shoes.
Oh, yeah.
We don't race in the same shoes, and a lot of times the shoes that I really like and that work for the events I'm training for are going to be totally inappropriate for athletes. So what I always recommend is athletes go to a run specialty store and make sure they get fit. I used to work in run specialty. Shout out to Coach Drew, who used to be my boss. And we would, I was blown away by how many people buy their shoes way too small. So make sure that you are getting fit by someone who knows what they're doing. And I would really recommend against just ordering shoes off Amazon, working with a run specialty shop to really figure out what the best shoes for you are and to get personalized guidance based on your preferences is huge. But it really just depends on what sort of terrain are you running in? Is this something you're going to need thicker lugs for? Are you going to need a rock plate? How much cushion do you like? Do you like a more sort of max cushion, or do you like more trail feel? Thinking about the drop of shoes, one of the only guidelines I tend to give is avoiding zero drop shoes, because we see that tends to cause a lot of lower leg issues, plantar fasciitis, because if you're running on zero drop, it puts additional stress on your lower legs because of the biomechanics. So that's not appropriate for everyone. There's some people that can do it totally fine, but not recommended. Another guideline I like to give people is that the barefoot and super minimalist thing, there's actually no compelling research that helps with biomechanics, longevity, anything. Again, Google Vibram 5-figure class action lawsuit if you want to spend your lunch break going really deep on this stuff.
Here's my one thing I think athletes should think about when buying a pair of shoes.
Yeah.
What is the out of box feel like? Does it feel comfortable on your foot right out of the box? Especially out of the box and onto the treadmill, or out of the box and around the parking lot. If it doesn't feel good there, likely it's not going to feel good at mile 20 of your marathon or mile 50 of your 100-miler.
Yeah.
So don't try to force a shoe to work for you because, maybe so-and-so uses it, or, whatever. Jim Walmsley's using that Tecton whatever now. Make sure it feels good on your foot from the get-go.
And makes sense for your biomechanics, makes sense for how you train, and makes sense for your specific event. If you're running a 6-hour marathon, you don't really need carbon shoes. I would just pick something that's comfortable. However, if you're trying to PR that marathon, we got to get some carbon shoes. And especially for trail runners, just make sure you pick something that is a good fit for the specific terrain demands that you'll be encountering.
How many miles should I run each week, Coach Zoe?
Oh, such a good question. This is one of the most common questions we get.
Should I even do my training by miles?
Well, So, how many miles should I run each week is sort of a proxy question for what should my training volume be. Most people who are new to running, the phrase training volume doesn't mean anything to them, and they conceive of training in miles. However, that's obviously something that we like to complicate for a lot of athletes, or to change up the approach. So, the number of miles you run, or the amount of time that you spend on your feet, because technical trails with lots of elevation gain can make the mileage less relevant, should determine the structure of your week. In general, the more miles or time you're able to run while staying healthy and recovering adequately, those are the operative phrases, staying healthy, recovering adequately, the faster you'll get. Some athletes might have more success by training by time rather than mileage. Switching from tracking distance to time places the focus more on effort rather than how far you go. And that's why we do use that technique with a lot of athletes.
Most of my trail athletes are doing that. I think it's a much stronger proxy that takes into account, elevation gain and then the technicality of those trails. Right. We don't need athletes to be doing 8-hour long runs in order to get their 20-mile in when they're, doing like 300 feet, per mile elevation change and stuff. I mean, it's just too much stress.
It's too much stress. And we want to be able to account for that stress, right? Like 20 miles on the roads is a totally different stress than 20 miles in super technical high alpine terrain.
Yeah.
So how do we account for that? And understanding that miles is just not always the best, most holistic tool for understanding that. It's also important to always understand the body doesn't know miles, it knows stress. Capping time on feet for technical terrain or winter conditions is a great way to maintain a training load that's productive without overstressing the body, since uneven surfaces can slow you down and add to the effort. So for athletes who are training at altitude or in challenging terrain, training by time can more effectively manage load mentally and physically. The caveat to this for me is if I'm training an athlete for a specific distance ultra, sometimes I do really like to have them to sort of get a sense for what 25 miles feels like.
Yeah.
So
a couple benchmark runs by miles, I think, can be helpful. It also can give the athlete an ability to understand, like, it's going to take me this long to cover this amount of terrain. That can help them with their race planning and stuff like that. But I do think, like, if you think about it, like, if you do training by time, the stress of that is going to be the same whether it's on the roads or the trails.
Yes.
That stress isn't going to change. But if you do training by miles, that stress is totally different if you're running around your neighborhood or you're running like up to the Maroon Bells.
Correct. And so this is something that we really want to grow over time, and it takes a ton of time. I was actually, so we really want to focus on expanding that, particularly that aerobic base, but building your capacity to handle training volume over time. Because the best and only way to get better is to do more, right? Like, we want to be smart about it. We don't want to just like immediately run a ton of totally unhelpful miles, but the only way to improve is to do more. Yep. So
how often should I take a rest day?
So usually 1 a week, maybe 2 for high stress athletes or injury prone athletes. And I always think it's better to rest at the first sign of injury. If I have an athlete that has a niggle pop up, I immediately recommend taking 3 days either totally off or 3 days to cross train, depending on the athlete's energy history, cross training history, and the nature of the injury in question.
It's better to take a couple days off now than several weeks or months off later.
Correct.
Do you have like a hard and fast rule for that? I know for me, if it's anything with an athlete that is more than a 2 out of 10 while running, and if it's any pain at all while walking around doing normal activities.
If it's any pain living daily life, we need to rest. And I would say if during the run, if symptoms escalate or change in presentation, then that's a sign that the running is aggravating the injury and we need to rest.
So important to stick to those rules and keep your health above, that like servicing the mileage and the volume. I know that, some athletes, they really cling to wanting to keep that volume up. And so they'll take that risk, they'll run a little bit more at like with that 2 out of 10 pain that increases during the run, or they'll be out there after the run and then their injury will hurt during the day. And then, they'll hope it will feel better tomorrow and they'll try their run again. And it's like likely those cycles just don't help. So
correct.
Be on top of it.
Right. And rest is an essential tool for maintaining consistency, right? Which might
Yeah.
seem paradoxical. How does not running help running? Well, rest is actually when these adaptations happen. So I always like athletes to reframe from rest day to adaptation day, because that's the day that your body is actually doing the most in building back from the stress stimulus that we've given it in training.
I love a good adaptation day.
We love adapting, because otherwise, if you're not adapting and if you're not recovering, then the training is at best bad for you, and at worst, like very, very detrimental or harmful, and a huge injury risk.
Yeah.
So recovery is training. Rest is training,
It's your most
which is
important
why
day.
I always really want like some active, like if you want to take like a light dog walk or be lightly active, fine. I try to dissuade athletes from like active recovery in the context of like, well, I did a 1 hour very easy bike ride. It's like, well, at best, that's neutral for your training, and at worst, you're really undermining your body's ability to adapt, because especially if we're doing big, like weekend volume back-to-back long runs, you really need that rest day after to replenish your glycogen stores and get ready for the next block of training midweek.
And for mental rest. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're just totally attuned to your athletics, evaluating each workout, how did this one feel? How's the next one going to go? What can I do today to get better tomorrow? Like if you're wrapped up in that 24/7, good luck showing up to your sessions fully refreshed and ready to actually give your best. That stuff adds up. So the rest day isn't just for the physiological side of things and the structural adaptations as well. It's also for the mental side of things.
Yeah.
Athletes need to be able to just take a day where they're not thinking about training.
Yeah, your brain is a body part, and it also needs rest and time to adapt. TJ, should I strength train? Should runners strength train? Should trail runners strength train?
All runners should strength train.
Yep. Yeah, so short answer, yes.
Easy answer. On to the next one.
Longer answer, how much and how really depends on your athletic background and goals. But most research indicates that strength training can boost performance and minimize injury risk when done correctly and strategically. So I always recommend that athletes start with an easy program that feels infinitely repeatable. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Oftentimes I'll see athletes they'll be like, okay, I know I've got a strength train. I'm going to immediately dive in head first and just do the most.
Yeah,
and then
hour-long sessions.
They go balls to the wall. They pick like
stuff.
crazy heavy lifts. They start doing body pump. They start doing these things that are not, or they start going to a squat class at their local gym. And they're doing like really higher volume strength, and in a way that's not strategic for their running. And that in fact detracts from your ability to run. So if you look at a strength routine and you don't feel that you can do it 2 to 3 to 4 times a week, that may not be a correct strength training program for you. Your strength training should add to your running, not take away from it.
What I like to see is athletes have 3 to 4 very light sessions a week that target areas of weakness. That ideally those are routines that have been assessed as a necessity to keeping overall health in running, and that comes from working with a PT and or a strength coach who can go hands-on with you and assess kind of your individual motor skills and your individual imbalances and what you need to be working on. And then I like to have athletes do one session in addition to that a week where the focus is building that strength through a more rigorous routine.
Absolutely. So I always recommend stacking strength training on your harder days, like workouts, but not long runs. That's too much stimulus. Don't overdo it, and don't make yourself sore before your long run or before your workout. That's a huge mistake that I see athletes go ham on strength training, and then they spend 3-4 days totally sore and unable to get the most out of their training. I want athletes to focus on single leg strength that mimics patterns similar to running. So doing a ton of really heavy squats is not going to be the most helpful and productive thing for your running. Doing super complicated lifts that in no way reinforce the biomechanics we want, not helpful. And always remember that a little bit of strength goes a really long way. In an ideal world, athletes would work with a strength coach to assess their goals and weaknesses and build a personalized program for them. But oftentimes less is more unless an expert guides you otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, really, it should be one session a week that invokes some soreness with those additional smaller sessions that are meant to really target those weaknesses. That is an ideal starting place for runners. More than that, and it's going to detract from the running quality.
Yeah.
And running quality, if you're an athlete who wants to run and get better at running quality needs to be top priority. And I think
oftentimes people take away from the running volume to do the strength. The goal of doing strength is to be able to increase our running volume, oftentimes, to make ourselves more durable, more injury resilient, stronger, to get more power out of our stride. So if your strength is taking away from the running, that's not what we want to see.
I feel like this leads directly to the question that we always get, which is, should I cross train?
Should runners cross train? It's not just my take. The research shows the best way to get better at running is to run more, to a point, right? Cross-training can be a productive way to build aerobic capacity while minimizing impact from running, since running is high impact. Cross-training can be anything from hiking, aqua jogging, rollerblading, swimming, rowing, boxing, using the elliptical. While things like cross-training or skiing could technically be considered cross-training, most coaches and training programs would recommend focusing on low-impact, aerobically focused activities that reduce musculoskeletal stresses.
Downhill skiing is not aerobically stressful. Sorry,
and
skiers.
Playing pickleball is not going to be helpful for your running. Cross-training exercises that complement the muscular demands of running by relying on opposing muscles are also ideal, because they can help correct muscle imbalances and make you a more resilient athlete. So, for example, cycling puts different demands on your quads, glutes, and hamstrings, so it can be a good addition to your running regimen, and mixing it up with different activity levels can also help with mental burnout. So how much should athletes be cross-training? Well, again, the answer really depends on your ideal training volume. And depending on your level of fitness, your goals, your injury risk, your interests, your training program can include cross-training workouts anywhere from an occasional one-off workout to a weekly staple. So for some athletes, I'll program like a flex day on Friday where it's like bike or rest, or bike or run or rest, and it's up to them to make the call. Sometimes I'll have an optional bike double for more advanced athletes. Or folks who do want to steadily increase their volume over time and can run 5 to 6 days a week. Runners who are more injury prone or who are new to the sport or returning after an extended break should rely more heavily on cross training than seasoned runners with the demonstrated tolerance for higher mileage weeks. So
I think also, for aging athletes too.
Yes.
Particularly those athletes who, are getting into their upper 50s and 60s and 70s. Cross training can be really helpful, especially after harder days, because we don't necessarily want to let up on those harder sessions, doing strides, doing workouts, things that help aging athletes maintain power and, a higher percentage of their VO2 max, which is something that really drops as you get older. We want to still have those key workouts, but sometimes, it's just too much on the structural systems to back that up with another run. So I really like to have athletes, cross train on days after that. And the same goes when you're going through a period of injury. If, it's actually, sometimes it can be productive to do some cross training there too.
So cross training is, I think something I always look out of, if I have an athlete that's injured potentially because of an energy deficiency, we really want to work to address the underlying causes of overuse, overtraining, or under recovery, especially if it's fuel related. And that's something that can sometimes set off alarm bells for me as a coach, is when an athlete gets injured, has an overuse injury, and then immediately is like, oh my God, I have to go on a 5-mile bike ride, or I'm like not going to be okay. I think that's always like, we need to always check ourselves before we wreck ourselves with cross training. And cross training workouts usually should be substituted for lower intensity recovery runs, maybe following a long run, tempo run, races, or other hard effort. So Sunday, sometimes, like if I have an athlete do a long run on Saturday, sometimes I can even have that Sunday be an optional double day or just a cross training day. Or if I have an athlete do like a focused effort type race, anywhere from 5K to 25K, maybe a more advanced athlete can do a very easy bike ride the day after a 50K. But the duration and intensity of your cross training session should be in line with an average easy to moderate run, right? Like if I assign an athlete a workout and then they just do that on the bike, that's like not helpful at all. because like that I design bike workouts very differently than I design run
for
workouts
sure.
because they are different
They're
sports
totally
and you can't
different.
just like cross them over.
No, and I really try to refrain from replacing when, like, if an athlete is going through an injury, whether it was an overuse injury or something, like a stress fracture, maybe something that was related to underfueling over time. A lot of athletes, they want to replace everything that they were doing with an activity that their PT says they can do, but then we're not addressing the underlying issue, which is some of those energy deficiencies. We're kind of just like offsetting one stress with another.
Right.
And so I'm very, very hesitant to like assign workouts on bike or elliptical. I feel like that time would be better spent resting, working on the habits and routines that the athlete needs to adopt in order to be more successful, more durable long term.
Correct. A lot of like injury is our body's way of saying, help, I need additional resources. I am not getting what I need. There is too much stress and not enough rest to provoke adaptations. And so we are in the space of breakdown. So unless you're able to increase your inputs, we need to decrease that output. And I think the injury is always a great time for athletes to assess if they're meeting their energy needs, if there's something in their routine, like if maybe that is a point where we need to talk about adding in strength training or adding in more cross training. But primarily, or managing stress better, but usually injury, unless it's like you stub your toe on a rock, overuse injury means we really need to assess input and output. And not assessing input and just switching our output to the Peloton, not helpful.
No.
So, for example, one way that I like athletes to incorporate cross training is, for example, if like your typical training run is 5 to 6 miles at 10-minute pace, a good cross training substitute would be 45 to 60 minutes of aqua jogging, spinning, swimming, whatever, at a similar heart rate or intensity level.
What about the elliptical?
What about it?
Are you a fan of the elliptical?
I am a fan of the elliptical for athletes who are limited by impact. So if I have an athlete coming back from a bone stress injury, I'll often assign like every other day of running and then intersperse elliptical training, because that one is going to be the most it mimics the patterns of running the most effectively while limiting impact. I know where you're going with this. I know that running and elliptical are different. I'm not asserting that they're the same thing at all, but it's the closest thing.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I use it very similarly with my athletes.
Yeah. All right. This is one that we get all the time. Is it okay that I walk during my runs?
Yes. And you know what? Let's not call it walking.
Yes.
Let's call it power hiking, because there's a totally different connotation to that. And especially if you are a trail runner, getting comfortable power hiking is something that is, just inherent in the process at every level. Jim Walmsley, Courtney DeWalter.
Everyone power hikes.
They all power hike. And so, I think over time, as we talked about in our previous podcast about how to get better running uphill, it is important to try to run more sections of the uphill. But if you're doing like an easy day, or you feel under recovered, or you're doing a recovery effort or a forever effort run, these 4 out of 10 RPE runs, you've got to just embrace the uphill power hike in way to help to ensure that your effort level is even throughout the run, and you're not getting into any other energy systems that would impact like the overall intention and purpose of that run. And so, I think it's important to remember, like, hiking uphill,
it should feel hard.
Yeah, it should feel easy,
it's not
easy,
a break.
moderate. Like 5 to 6 out of 10 RPE is good.
But like, just because you're not running doesn't mean to take your foot off the gas.
Yeah.
So I really think it's important for athletes to really ensure that they're matching. They have a consistent effort level throughout the run. Just because you're power hiking, that doesn't mean we like totally like, oh, we're walking. I still really need athletes to lean into that hill to match the grade of the hill with their upper body, and think about power. I think using poles is great in this instance, or if it's like a shorter hill, you can sort of put your hands on your quads and use that to get sort of additional torque and leverage. And then sort of like an intermediary technique that I use is the mall walk. So this is like something that I feel like I employed a lot at Run Rabbit, but this is like in the context of a longer effort on douche grade where sustaining a run doesn't feel correct or possible, but it doesn't quite feel like a power hike. You can sort of think of an aggressive mall walk, swinging your arms to get that momentum going, and just keeping it above a full walk. But very intentional and very purposeful, still leaning into the hill. I think the biggest mistake I see beginner trail runners make is they just, as soon as they're walking, like it's a totally different effort. They're just like, they're fully in chill mode. They're eating a sandwich, going up the hill. We want to make sure that it still feels powerful and intentional and the effort remains consistent. But everyone walks. I just want everyone to realize that it's an opportunity, not a break.
All right, let's talk about what makes elites elites.
Yeah.
And we've got an observational study here to look at that looked at 41 runners. 20 were elite and 21 were just experienced, so kind of amateurs.
Yeah, experienced amateurs, meaning not total beginners.
Yeah. What did we get into on this?
So researchers were really trying to look at the differences between these amateur and elite athletes. So researchers looked at the training history of the athletes. They looked at their running economy as measured on a treadmill, their biomechanics taken during the economy test on the treadmill, and neuromuscular performance. So here is like the reason I wanted to talk about the study is because looking at the differences between elites and amateurs can help us. It doesn't totally dictate how we guide amateurs, right? Like, it's not like we saw the study and immediately changed everything we did. This was an observational study, so it's not like they changed something and saw people get better. They were just trying to assess the differences between two groups. And so I think that there's a lot of really good takeaways. And I think like the big headline for this is it's much simpler than people think. And elites really aren't doing anything that fancy or special or crazy.
I think like the things that I think are just worth highlighting, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on, are the main differences here are that elites are more efficient.
Yes.
So the cost of them running, the metabolic costs, the oxygen consumption, it's lower for elites than it is for non-elites. And also biomechanically, elites are going to be more efficient than non-elites. So, I mean, this probably feels fairly obvious, and I think there's one more obvious thing here. Obviously, elites are just going to run at higher volumes than non-elites.
And that was seen as the biggest difference, right? So, like, if you want to get better at running, the goal is to increase your volume sustainably and strategically over time. And that's how you get more efficient. And I think that the takeaway from that is that the biggest differences purely stem from that training volume. They're not doing complicated things in the gym. They're not doing like significantly, it's not like they're all hitting 25-mile long runs. It's nothing maybe as flashy or specific as people might think. It's just that they're running more. So again, training volume means that elite athletes had better running economy, they had better spatiotemporal parameters, and that means step frequency, length, and contact time. So higher
length.
volume resulted in a more biomechanically efficient stride, as well as extensor strength and muscle type in the leg. So that's really that's
more slow twitch muscle fibers.
Yes, more slow twitch muscle fibers, which improved with increased training and with increased training volume and training age. So like years accumulated over time, right?
Years of easy running.
So I think another big lesson here is don't just ramp up your volume out of nowhere. Your short and long-term ramp rates need to meet you where you're at. There's no shortcut to accumulating this type of training volume. It just means slowly, strategically increasing over years and years and years. And actually, we're going to talk about a different study next week, but the thing that really jumped out to me about it that I can't wait to talk about is that it looked at the 60 champions defined as top performers in given running distances from the 5K to the marathon. And it essentially asserted that you need 8 to 10 years to get good at running, which I was like, that's a time frame I agree with,
I feel like that's the standard for, reaching an international level.
That's correct. So give yourself that long runway. I think another important thing to talk about here is strength training of elite runners versus non-elite runners.
Yeah,
so
let's get into that a bit.
the researchers said that some strength training might be beneficial for non-elite trail runners to help close the gap in leg strength. So they did a leg strength test in the form of testing like how powerfully could they extend their leg. And elite runners had stronger leg extension than non-elite runners. And that doesn't mean that mid-packers need to hit the gym for leg day multiple times a week. So in the study, elites and non-elites were incorporating, on average, only 1 hour a week of strength training. And there was no indication of how that strength training time was spent. So that's sort of a gap in the study, is that, likely, there were probably some people doing significantly more, but there were definitely a lot of people who logged 0 hours of strength training in both the elite and non-elite groups. And there wasn't a huge volume pattern that we saw with strength training versus volume, right? It came out loud and clear in the study, training volume will help you get faster. It did not come out super loud and clear that time in the gym will help you get faster. It was sort of elite runners have better leg extension strength, which can be improved from time in the gym, but can also be improved from training volume.
Well, there's also a number of studies that have been done on ways to increase running economy, which is when we go back 3 minutes and discuss elites. They're more efficient. They have better running economy. So strength is a way to increase running economy.
Correct.
If you can increase how much power you can put into each stride, you can become more efficient. So strength training can be really, really important. But I think the key thing in here is to see the indication of how that strength training is time is spent. What I hear in that is, each runner is doing what is unique and meant for them, based likely on experts that they have on their team, specifically with those elite athletes, while amateurs are more likely going to try to throw everything in the kitchen sink at their strength. They're going to do, what they see on Instagram, or, they're going to grab these plans off of Runner's World. And a lot of that stuff is great places to start.
Right.
But you might only get so far with those plans before you need to add in a little more of that expertise. So, how those athletes are spending that time, or how they're chunking it up over the course of a week, it should look theoretically different for each athlete, because strength needs to address each individual's needs.
And your goals and your background. So a relatively small increase in strength training, especially with in knee extension activities and whole leg extension. So that would be exercises like step ups, Bulgarian split squats, etc., single leg deadlifts. Those are going to have the most meaningful impact. Single leg strength, we talked about it earlier. That's going to be the most meaningful. Think about making it so that your leg is better at extending. But it's unlikely that even more resistance training, weightlifting, plyometrics will continue to deliver greater performance benefits. So for goals associated with trail running, there's a dose response to strength training, and then increasing the dose no longer increases the benefit. So I think that it's important to recognize that more strength training doesn't always mean more better.
What do you think? My favorite takeaway from this is that the silver bullet is...
There is no silver bullet.
Right.
The secret is there is no secret. You need 8 to 10 years of consistent training.
And I love that, because I love that for me personally.
I know. I feel like that's probably so frustrating for people to tune into the podcast, and it's every week we're just keep working.
Right. Keep working. There is no secret.
It would be so much easier if we were here's 5 secret hacks to get faster and better at running. But you just got to build that volume over years and years and years. And that's why we really see athletes who have the best outcomes, and also enjoy the process the most, are people who just do it longer. And I think that it's really important to sort of have everything in training be in service of that longevity and that consistency. So when you pick goals that facilitate that longevity. Don't immediately jump into a marathon if you're not feeling stoked and ready, or a 100 miler if you're not feeling stoked and ready. Pick goals that are going to facilitate you building that volume over time and improving and really trying to master the process.
And understand that there are a lot of ups and downs in this, process. Take that, message from Simone Biles that, you can take a step back when you need to, take space to move forward and progress. This is not a linear process. Results won't always grow on the results you had before. And as much as we want that to be the truth, there's, this process relies on setbacks. They're inherent in this process, plateaus, and not always feeling like you're getting better. And so, I love that we talked about patience 2 podcasts ago as being a core principle in this. And, that's something that I wish these studies talked more about was the mindset of elites versus
that would just be a different study. We we did look at that study of elites, and it, and go back a few podcasts later where we did look at one of the best cross-sectional studies on the mentality of, well, it wasn't elites, it was just successful runners. I'll dig into this, and I'll see if there's a study of elite athletes versus just successful runners. But something I want to impress upon athletes is that greatness is a choice. Simone Biles is great because she chose to respond to adversity in the way that she did. It doesn't just happen. You make it happen, and you choose to make it happen. It's not just like, I don't think it's the thing of are you born great or do you achieve greatness? I think that's bullshit. Everyone decides to be great in their own way. And that, to me, greatness is navigating adversity. It's not just folding at the first time things get hard.
She chose that. That's part inherent in her way of being. That's how she shows up.
And I'm sure it wasn't easy.
It's not supposed to be.
Yeah. So make the choice today.
Well, I can't think of a better way to close out the pod.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.